that was a lot of definitions on the previous page, and it doesn't really mean much until we can put it all together in an example. So this example is going to tie those definitions in as well as tie in a bunch of other things that we've learned in this chapter. So this data set shows the average annual pharmaceutical spending, in other words, spending on prescription drugs, in dollars per person for a random sample of countries in 2021. Now we have to find all the following. But before we go off and do that, we kind of need to know what all these things are. So X bar, for example, we learned what X bar was back in section 3.1. It's the sample mean, right? So this is the mean right here. N is number, which is sample size. We learned that in section 1.1, but it's also actually in the formula. Sample size is right there, right? It's opposed to capital N, which is population size. S we learned in section 3.2. S is the standard deviation for a sample. Of course, these are all sample values because this is a sample of countries, right? So these are sample standard deviation, sample mean, sample size. S squared is variance, right? We learned that in section 3.2. P25, we just saw a page ago. P25 is the first quartile. The 25th percentile is the first quartile. Q2 is so special, it actually has three names. Q2 is the median, which is also P50. It could show up either way. So that's the median. And then P75 is the third quartile. IQR, we know that's IQR, right? It's Q3 minus Q1, but we won't need to worry about that because StatCrunch will find it for us. The min is the min, the max is the max. The range we learned is the max minus the min, but again, we won't have to worry about it because StatCrunch will find it for us, and the mode. Speaking of which, let's go find all of these values in StatCrunch. So I have this data set loaded for you in our data set sheets. So if I go here, we are in section 3.4, prescription spending. So I'm going to click on this link and it will take me to the StatCrunch data set. And there it is. Okay, so prescription spending is right here. So we want to find this the same way we found the mean and everything else earlier in this chapter. So we go to stat, summary stat, columns, because all of our data set is in a column. We click on the column we want, which is prescription spending. And then we click on the particular things we're interested in. So we want the mean, right? Then we wanted N. So I'm going to use my control button. I'm going to hold down my control button and click. And then I wanted the standard deviation and the variance. Now, if you're on a Mac, you'll have to do command button and then click. And then it wanted, I'm doing these actually in the order that they're listed, so that makes it easier for me. P25 was Q1. Then the medians right here, that's Q2. And then P75 is Q3. IQR is right there, IQR. Then the min and the max, which I've gone too far. There they are, min, max, range. And the mode is at the very bottom, mode. So you can see they're in the order you want. They don't have to be in order. It just makes things easier for when you have to write them all down. All right, so there are all the values. Pause the video and write all of them into your boxes, and I will do the same. Keep in mind you want up to 3 decimal places wherever it's needed. So it would be needed right here for standard deviation. You would need to round that to 4 there, right? And then I think that's the only one that needs rounding. All right, I wrote them in as well. And you also want to make note to yourself of how we did get all of this in StatCrunch. It should be on your exam notes packet as well, but there you have it. So it's stat, summary stat, columns. That's our path. And we find all of our values. And again, you don't have to do it in order. It just makes things a little bit easier if you did do them in order. All right, so now we want to interpret the value of Q3 in the context of the situation. Okay, so Q3 is a percentile, right? Q3 is P75, right? It's the 75th percentile. So we have to use our script for interpreting percentiles that we learned back when we learned percentiles in this section. So it was right here. So the first thing you'll do is make your percentile into a percentage, right? So such percent of the observations are less than or equal to the value. So Q3 is this number right here. So you start by saying Q3 is P75. So you say 75% of, now what was this about? Right? This isn't test scores, right? So this is something else. So this was countries, right? 75% of countries. And then it's up to us how we want to say this. We kind of have to get the at or below this value, right? 826.5. But what was it about? Countries spend on their prescription drugs. So countries spend less than or equal to, right? There's that piece of script. And then less than or equal to 826.5 dollars per person, right? You want to include the unit. There's the unit right there. Dollars per person on prescription drugs. I'm just going to say on RX. We all know what that means, right? So you have to turn the 75 into a percent. And then you have to kind of talk about what it was. So it's countries spending on prescriptions, right? This is the context, right? The countries spending on the prescriptions. And then you have to have the less than or equal to the value, right? So there's your Q3 value right there, right there. So that's where that piece goes in. And then the rest of it is all just trying to get the context out in a way that makes English sense. Right? So that there's other ways to write it. So you could say 75% of the pharmaceutical spending for countries is less than or equal to this value. That's another way you could say it. All right, now what about the lower fence? Well, we just saw the definition of lower fence. Lower fence is Q1 minus 1.5 times the IQR. So we want to write that in. Let me do it with an orange pen here. Q1 minus 1.5 times IQR. All right, Q1 was 583. So 583 minus 1.5 times the IQR, which is 243.5. You can also do times with a parentheses there. That's fine. What you don't want to do is do the parentheses portion, multiply, and then do that. It doesn't work out. What you want to do is write it exactly as it's written in Desmos. I can tell you right now, phone calculators regularly do this wrong. Students regularly do this calculation wrong because they're trying to do the parentheses part. The parentheses there is not a grouping symbol. The parentheses there is just to remind you to do multiplication. So you want to type it, 583, that's the Q1, minus 1.5 times the 243, 243.5. That is your lower fence. So it is 217.75. If you're interested, it would actually have the same unit as your data set. It'd be dollars per person, but we don't really care right now. All right, now what about upper fence? Upper fence is Q3 plus 1.5 times IQR. Q3 was 826.5. So you take 826.5 plus 1.5. The IQR didn't change, 243.5. But you have to remember this one's a minus, this one's a plus. Otherwise, they don't get calculated correctly. So 826.5 plus 1.5 times 243.5. And we get 1191.75 or $1,191.75 per person, right? Because this is money. Again, if you're interested, you could write dollars per person. Right? It's not strictly required, but dollars per person. Okay. Were there any outliers in this distribution? So remember, outliers are anything that are past those fences. That's the official way to check for outliers. Anything that is outside the fences, less than the lower fence or bigger than the upper fence, right? Okay, so are any values in here below 217.75? Well, yes, there has to be because the min is 162. So if I think I put the data set in order actually, that'll make things easier. So right down here, 162 is an outlier because 162 is below the lower fence. So we're going to say yes, 162 is below the lower fence. That's an outlier. And let's see, anything above 1191, which we have right here. So we have this outlier as well. So 1564 is above the upper fence. So both of those are outliers. Right? Anything below the lower fence or above the upper fence is an outlier. All right, now let's look at Ecuador. Ecuador spent about $494 per person on pharmaceuticals. We're going to find Ecuador's z-score. All right, now the z-score, that takes us back to the beginning of this section. That's your value minus your mean divided by your standard deviation. Okay, so the value for Ecuador is right here, right? This is Ecuador's value, 494. So we're going to take 494 minus the mean we have above. It's 712.75. So 712.75. And we're going to divide it by the standard deviation, which was 260.694. And this will be approximate. We're going to have to do 3 decimal places here. Okay, so let's go run that calculation. All right, so remember when you want a z-score, you hit the division first to make the fraction. That's the easiest way. The other way to do it is to put it in parentheses. 494 minus 712.75, close your parentheses, and then hit division, and it'll work out 260.694. And we get a z-score of negative 0.839. That's the z-score for Ecuador. Now, was Ecuador unusual? Well, to be unusual, you have to have a z-score that is less than -2 or more than +2. If your z-score is between -2 and 2, it is not unusual. We learned that in this section. So a z-score of negative 0.839 would be right here. You haven't even made it to -1, right? You're right there. So it is not unusual. So because the z-score for Ecuador, which is a lovely country in South America, it has the Galapagos Islands, is between -2 and 2. And that is not unusual. Right? To be unusual, you got to be outside of that zone.